I'm just going to share a few thoughts about our joint center and the conference in general. So this is the annual conference, the 2022 annual conference of a joint center of advanced study entitled World Making from Global Perspective, a dialogue with China. That connects several German universities with each other. The University of Göttingen, here now the host of this annual conference, the University of Würzburg, Heidelberg, Free University of Berlin, and also the University of Munich, as well as some other partners inside and outside of Germany. We are being funded by the German Ministry of Education and Research, and we are very grateful for that. And each of the participating locations has its own theme. So if you're interested in that, our online audience, please check our website on worldmakingsomething.org. You will find it under World Making. If you Google World Making, a dialogue with China, you will find it. So we already had like a day of conferences, and these are our public panels. And like this, the beginning of our public sessions will be a panel with very distinguished and very interesting speakers. And the subject of the panel is Carrier or Challenger, China and East Asia in Contemporary Debates on World Order. And I think contemporary debates, we have to widen the definition of contemporary and say also the past had contemporary issues. So some of them will be of our panels will also be talking and taking historical perspectives on this very subject matter. So our first speaker is Sebastian Conrad. He holds the chair of modern history at the Free University of Berlin. He heads and directs the MA program in global history and the graduate school in global intellectual history. And he has been a fellow at various institutions in different parts of the world. He's also an elected member of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the Academia Europaea. And he works on East Asia, primarily Japan, and global history. And many of us know like his book, What is Global History? That was first appeared in German and was published by Princeton University Press in 2016. And of course, he has written many, many more books and articles. So Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, yeah. Well, while this is being set up, we'll be stretching the limits of contemporary, absolutely. I have 15 minutes. What can we squeeze into 15 minutes? East Asia, geopolitics, and so forth. I thought maximum one person, and I'll focus on the life of one person who's probably fairly unknown to most of you, except for Selçuk Ezenbel, who knows him well. And essentially, I'll be talking about this person, Ito Chuta. He's an architect, actually. So first appearance of an architect here in the context of our conference. So what's the question? Why this guy? What's the problem? What's the puzzle that I'll be addressing? In 1902, he said goodbye to his family in Tokyo, to his relatives, to all of his friends. They came to Shimbashi to say goodbye, and he left and came back only after 3 years. His wife was pregnant, his daughter was born in the meantime, so he met her for the first time when he returned. And his 3-year travel of the world was in many ways a challenging endeavor. He traveled through Asia, all the way to Europe, endured, he started out on a donkey. It's not like today where you board an EasyJet plane. He endured incredible cold, incredible heat as well. One of his companions contracted malaria and died. Loneliness, right? Whenever he was lonely, he drew these sketches that are part of the 12 volumes of travelogue that he produced. But why all this? Why all these troubles? He did this in order to prove the following proposition, namely that this temple, the Horyuji temple in Nara, is actually as beautiful as any Greek temple. It is as beautiful because it is actually directly influenced by ancient Greece. That's his thesis, and this quest to prove this thesis will be the subject of my talk, and it will, I hope, give us the opportunity to think about how Japan, or through the particular eyes of Ito Chuta, imagines itself at the end of or the beginning of the 20th century, how this force field of China, Japan, and the West is played out in very dynamic ways, and how at the end of his life, he moved from, as I call it at the beginning, from Greece to Asia as the main reference point, which is in some ways the trajectory of modern Japan more generally. So let's briefly think about, I'll briefly introduce the guy. Ito, he started his studies of architecture at the University of Tokyo, which looked like this back in the days. Doesn't look like that anymore. He studied architecture, which was a new field, and like most disciplines was taught by a European, in this case by Josiah Conder, who taught architecture in English, essentially using European models. And this was the training that he also received. And when it came to his MA thesis, where he had to design a particularly telling building, young Ito came up with this, a 13th century Catholic French cathedral. It might have well been, E.T. or something. It was completely out of his, if you will, imagination, but obviously it was exactly what was taught. The term architecture itself referenced Europe, essentially, right? It was a Eurocentric discipline. So if you talked about the development of the world history of architecture, it was about European buildings, almost by definition. But for the rest of his life, we could almost say, Ito was busy disproving this proposition. In other words, criticizing his own MA thesis, if you will. And he did this when he started to write his PhD, which was actually on the Horyuji temple. Now, this temple, this is actually a picture that Ito himself took. The argument is this temple is Greek in its core, right? I mean, you may not exactly see the Greek character of it. This is a present-day photograph. The Horyuji, after all, it's the oldest extant building in all of Japan. It's in fact the oldest existing wooden building anywhere in the world, and of course the UNESCO heritage site at that. So the Greek character doesn't become immediately obvious when we look at this. So we need to move closer because it's the main building that shows us its Greek qualities. And here is Ito himself. He says, and this is where this is where he discerns the Greekness of it. Once you enter into the main building, you can see that the columns have an entices, which essentially means that they have this kind of shape, right? The more you go up, the smaller the perimeter. That is very Western. And in this way, the building conserves elements of Chinese style, traces of Indian style, and moreover, a legacy of Greek style. Could be, could not be, right? Difficult to say. At the moment, it's only a thesis. So how do you prove that? He did so by essentially, I mean, this is the idea. How could this be? So, all right, there is, these are Greek temples, like let's say the Parthenon, for an example. Through Alexander the Great and its conquest of parts of Central Asia, South Asia, Greek culture came all the way into South Asia, and in particularly survived in what is sometimes called the Gandhara culture or the Kushan Empire. And from there, via the Silk Road, sort of trickled into China, then into Korea, and then finally Japan. That's the direct route of influence. How do you prove that? Well, Ito says, I'll pack my things and I'll just go and re-engineer the same travel, if you will, backwards, right? And I'll show and I'll prove to the world that this is exactly where the influence went. So he approached the Mombusho, which is the Japanese Ministry of Education, and said, this is what I would like to do. And they said, no. I mean, he was asking for money, obviously. And the Mombusho at that time, like the Ministry of Education in the Federal Republic. Anyway, in Japan at the time, they were sending scholars abroad all the time, right? They sent them to Berlin or Heidelberg, to Vienna or Baltimore, but not to Asia. And I mean, if you will, the mental map of modern Japan obviously was that to learn the modern disciplines in their European settings was exactly what was needed to modernize the field of knowledge, but traveling to India or China didn't really do the trick. So essentially, at the end, they said, look, we give you the money on one condition, that you also travel to Western Europe. And Ito said, all right, if that's the price to pay, I'll do it. And so he left. This is his travel, essentially leaving from, this doesn't work. Anyway, you can see from Japan through China, where he spent 9 months or even 10, then through India, where he spent another 8 months, and then through the Red Sea, arrived in Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, where, as Selçuk Ezenbil knows very well, he spent another 8 months or so traveling Ottoman lands, and then finally on to Greece, which is really the destination, obviously, right? And yes, then on to Paris and London and San Francisco, fine, just to make sure he kept his promise. Now, on this trip, he saw, an enormous amount of different objects and places and sites in the Himalaya. I mean, he traveled, as you saw on the map, extensively, and he drew some of these places. But the pivotal moment of his travels came early on when he discovered, as it's usually called, the so-called Yungang grottos. Now, certainly he wasn't the one to discover them, right? Somebody else took him there. But this is where he felt that his whole theory was being validated, because, as he said himself, not in my dreams did I think that such a discovery was possible. The sculptures of the Buddha were very similar to the Buddha on the mural in the Horyuji. And at the same time, there were many similarities with ornaments and architectural forms in Greece. So here you have the proof that what came from Greece arrived in China and then was transferred. And so he certainly believed that his thesis was validated. The broader reading public in Japan agreed as well, and it made his fame and his prestige. Now, let's briefly think about what he's actually doing here. So he wants to criticize, as I said earlier, right, the Eurocentrism of this whole idea of architecture, which essentially compelled him to design a Catholic cathedral. The textbooks that he was using when he was a student were textbooks like this one by Bannister Fletcher, that charted the history of world architecture in a, we can easily imagine, Eurocentric way, right? So, for example, this is from Bannister Fletcher's book. This is the tree of architecture, where you see the various different lineages. So here's the Greek, or the Roman, the Renaissance, and so forth, the usual story that we know, right? There is also Chinese and Japanese or Indian architecture, but as you can easily imagine, it leads nowhere, right? It's not part of the organic development, right? Or we could even call it evolution of the history of architecture. So what people like Ito were after were to disprove, right, this kind of framework. There is a chapter in Bannister Fletcher's book that's on Chinese and Japanese architecture, and it's called, which in a way says it all, right? So Ito, in his view, and I think you can easily see immediately how he imagines and visualizes things very differently. This is how he sees the connection between different parts of the world in the history of architecture, where you see cross-fertilization, not a sort of a tree that almost goes up in columns or ends up nowhere. So the whole agenda, if you will, of his travels was to place Japan and East Asia more broadly in this world history of architecture. Now, for the sake of time, I'll briefly say something about, this is not simply a scholarly agenda, but it's part and parcel of a much more broader geopolitical constellation. So whenever he says architecture and whenever he says Greece, he essentially says this in a language that resonates with broad processes that shape East Asia and Japan at that time. And as we have very strict timekeepers, as I know, I'll just very briefly give a couple of hints how this can be situated. So on the one hand, his quest for architecture and the value and if you will, the emphasis on the value of architecture is part and parcel of the nation building processes that happen in Europe or in East Asia at this time. So it's linked to this moment of nation building, where latecomer nations like Japan have there's a very typical and particular emphasis on the power of the arts, right? It's the moment where the typical Japanese phrasing is wakon yosai, where yes, we need to import technology, but the core, or should I say the soul, after our discussion yesterday, of the nation is situated in the arts, right? And people like Partha Chatterjee, they have theorized exactly this mechanism, how geopolitics translates into a particular way of defining the nation. So in that respect, looking at old temples isn't just a pastime, but it really goes at the core of nation building. Second, it's obviously also linked to empire, right? And we could say a lot about this, but to be brief here on this one, Ito himself, he wasn't, what you would call an outright imperialist, but he was certainly someone who operated under the conditions of empire. That's also how we need to read his travels, right? It's after all an imperial situation. And he himself, this is just a reminder that the Japanese empire was actually quite extended, but he himself was implicated in this empire building process, mostly through two signature buildings that he built. This is in 1925, the Shinto Shrine in Seoul, the capital of Korea, and he also built the Shinto Shrine in Taipei. So he, in some ways, he was the author of the iconic and, if you will, symbolic places of Japanese authority in the colonies. And as you'll know, as soon as the war is over, the first thing that the Koreans do is take down this thing here, right? So empire is clearly one of the contexts. The third one is there's also a political economy story to be told here. Just as a quick sort of buzzword here, the Japanese presence, for example, at the world exhibitions when countries competed for, let's call it international attention. What is the Japanese capital that goes into the making of these exhibitions? It's this cultural capital, obviously, woodblock prints, for example, but then also this kind of architecture. And finally, the fourth process that I want to briefly hint here at is the authority of the natural sciences. Because this is a more intricate story, but very briefly, this is a moment where architecture comes to stand in for culture in a way that until then, other forms of cultural expression, in particular texts, had done, right? So Ito operates here at a moment when, let's see what, when we move from, it's sometimes called in the literature, from philology to archaeology. In other words, from something that you can interpret to something that looks hard and real and irrefutable. So Ito himself, he says, look, we can, if we read texts, all right, this is his quote, and I'll read. Ordinary documents are diverse and they contain lies. Additions cannot be made to architecture, neither can lies. Architecture exists as it is. There are no such things as forged architecture in the world. It's not quite true, right? If you've been to Dubai, for example, or but there are forged documents. Nothing speaks of the past as accurately as architecture. So this is an interesting moment in the history of discipline where architecture begins to stand in for, irrefutable historical truth, and the authority of the natural sciences gives added weight to his case. All right, this is essentially my story. This is why Ito traveled all the way through China and India, the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, to Europe to make his case. This is in 1902-3. And just as a coda, things change. Very quickly, after the Russian-Japanese war, they begin to shift, and some of the things that also Wang Hui talked about, the sort of larger geopolitical shifts happened at that moment, and they also compelled, or let's say induced, Ito Chuta himself to rethink his, let's call it, geopolitical imagination. Final sentences, yeah. And he does this, right, this is, if you will, the PS to my story. He shifts attention from Greece to Asia. The turning point is clearly the Russia-Japanese war. This is the moment when in Asian countries the anti-imperialist discourse begins to speed up. It's the moment when, as Prasenjit calls it, the larger paradigm shifts from there's one civilization and you have more of it or less, to there are various civilizations that compete with each other. And if we look at the discourse that surrounds this, it's interesting that it shifts from reform and progress to terms like climate and culture and soul, right? Last image, 1934, the most famous building that Ito ever built in Tokyo, in Tsukiji, for those of you who've been to Tokyo, no longer looks Greek in any way, but looks like this. Now, it is India and not Greece that provides the resources that drive Japan's particular trajectory into modernity. And even in his now, in the 1930s, he sees in the Horyuji primarily India and no longer Greece, right? And of course, and this is my last sentence, and in some ways, to link this also to all of your interests and to the conference, in some ways, both the maneuver to see Greece in Nara and then the reversal to see India in Nara are both ways to not speak of China when talking about Japan's modernity.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this very stimulating and intellectually challenging talk. I think, your theme, this example of cross-Asian relations in their global context and intellectual claims related to these relations connects very well with the next speaker, because his expertise, actually much of his work, deals with the history of inter-Asian relations in their global context, especially Sino-Indian relations. And the speaker is Professor Tan-Sen Sen, who is based in Shanghai at New York University in Shanghai. He would have been here as a fellow here in Göttingen and would have joined us in person for our annual conference. But of course, because of the pandemic situation, he was unable to travel. He is a professor of history and the director of the Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai, and is an associate professor at the Department of History at NYU in New York. And he's written many books and edited also an additional number of volumes. Just to name one, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, the realignment of Sino-Indian relations from 600 to 1400. Currently, he's working on 3 books at the same time. He's working about Zheng He's maritime expeditions in the early 15th century, a monograph on Nehru and China. And together with Eng Sang-ho, he is editing the Cambridge History of the Indian Ocean, the first volume of that history. So Tan-Sen, welcome to our panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dominic. And I would like to thank Janice for inviting me. Yes, unfortunately, I couldn't make it to Europe because of the lockdown in Shanghai. Just didn't have the time to go back to New York and then fly to Germany. What I'm going to do is actually connect with Sebastian's presentation in some ways and also link it up to Barbara's presentation yesterday. I'm going to emphasize or try to emphasize in this conference on world making is about unmaking, which I think is also important to study. And what I've been doing, let's see if this works, is to connect something that Sebastian said, I think the general context, which was linking Japan and India was facilitated through Okakura's Pan-Asianism. And I see three different phases of what we can call Asianism or Asian century. The first one is, of course, Okakura's Pan-Asianism, which came at the moment that Sebastian ended his presentation. The second one is in the 1950s, and the third one is the current century, 21st century, where we are talking about a new Asian century again, and very much connected to Sebastian's narrative as well. This is an alternative way of looking at Asia beyond a European colonial narrative. What Okakura emphasized was the cultural linkages of the past. He had China in there. I'll bring his quote later on in the slide. But as we all know that his Pan-Asianism, in fact, the book he wrote was about Japanese art rather than on China and India. But the Japanese military took it over and it modified it, became part of its empire building, and Okakura's Pan-Asianism collapsed. The 1950s is a period of decolonization, Asian unity, solidarity. Many of the Asian states are now coming up, and they are now thinking about Asia very differently from Okakura, but connected to many of the things that Okakura had said. It also had a creation of an Asian world order through this political concept of Panchsheel. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's very anti-US at this time, the narrative that's going on in many parts of Asia, especially China and India at this point. It ends again with the border conflict between China and India in 1962. Now, this is the new one, just an overview that now the shift has taken place to the economic dominance of Asian countries. There is global interdependence that is emphasized. Perhaps, again, an alternate model to the Western model of economic growth. And it's now being impacted by various kinds of local and global geopolitics. So perhaps the Asian century will end before it starts again. My talk today is basically in the 15 minutes on the 1950s. This is what I've been working on to look at the 1950s, starting with, this is the very famous quotation from Okakura, Asia is one. And he emphasizes the idea of China and India as the major players of this Asia as one concept. I think many of you would be familiar with his arguments. What I wanted to emphasize is, as I said, the unmaking of the world making. And I see the four important ways in which the whole idea of the Asianism or Asian world collapses. One has to do with territorial claims. It has to do with the contending ideologies of nation states. The centrality of China and India, given the fact I work on China and India, I think it's problematic. Asia is understood through China and India. I think that creates a problem. And the fact is that Asia is not one. I think Amitav Acharya wrote about this in a Journal of Asian Studies article. In the 1950s, what I see as the Asian world, and this world for me is the concept of Genetopul Gode, who wrote about a world system in 13th century. There's no geographical borders as such, but 1947 is when the Asian Relations Conference takes place, and many of the things in the 1950s are basically connected to that Asian Relations Conference in Delhi. 1947, you have the Afro-Asian Solidarity Conferences and initiatives that people have written about, the Asian Games that comes around, and other inter-Asian sporting events also connected to the Asian Relations Conference. The Delhi Conference, again, a conference of Asian countries in 1955, and of course, everybody knows the Bandung Conference in 1955. But what I've been looking at is, other than these main state-directed initiatives, what I call the Asianism ecosystem or the Asian world of 1950s. And I've been mostly focusing on publications and the dialogue between civil society members, basically between China and India, but also Indonesia. Today, I wanted to emphasize two of these publications that I look at. Blitz is a tabloid that was published from Bombay. I highlight this, Asia's foremost news magazine. I would like you to keep this in mind later on, how it changes. But this whole idea about the golden age of Asia, this is 1954, Zhou Enlai meeting with Nehru. But the other newspaper that I'm looking at is the Kwangming Daily, which since 1949 has been emphasizing various kinds of Asian solidarity, unity ideas, including the Asian Women's Conference that took place in December 1949. This Blitz is something that was established in 1949 as India's Blitz against Hitler. The person who founded it and was the editor of this newspaper was a Parsi called Karanjia. It was a left-leaning, pro-Nehru, but anti-Congress tabloid, very, very anti-American. It had a circulation of 700,000, and it claimed that there were more than 500,000 readers in the early 1950s. The other newspaper that people doing China would be very familiar with is the Kwangming Daily. It's called the Intellectual Run Chinese newspaper, launched in 1949. It was set up by the China Democratic League. It was run until 1957 in a very, very interesting way. There were many Chinese intellectuals who contributed to this newspaper. And this one of the chief editors who did not last for long, Chu Anping, was quite critical about the CCP and was declared rightist later on, like many other editors of Kwangming Daily. The Asian world of 1954-55, which I would say is the peak of this Asian golden age, the second golden age of China, India. It can be seen through the Geneva Conference in 1954, where Zhou Enlai makes an important speech. By 1954, there's a very important treaty that the PRC signs with India and Burma. The Conference of Asian Countries in Delhi in 1955, and then, of course, the Bandung Conference in 1955. So 1954-55 seems to be the time when the Asian world is actually coming true. But we see this reflected in the sayings of many people. Zhou Enlai says, Asia today is no longer Asia of yesterday. It's a very anti-colonial narrative. Sukarno in Bandung, when he is opening the conference, also emphasizes that there's a new Asia and a new Africa that have been born. And it's not just rhetoric. The reality of this is seen in the Panchsheel Treaty that was actually Sukarno's idea that Zhou Enlai and Nehru then signed up to, which calls upon the Asian governments to create their own alternative way of doing geopolitics. And then this dialogue among the nation states gets reflected in the newspapers, and that's what I've been looking at. So here you have Owen Lattimore contributing about Asia reconquering Asia. And Asians for Asia idea, the century of Asia coming into Blitz. The same thing can be seen actually in Kwangming Daily. You can notice the change in Kwangming Daily from 54 to 55, how the Chinese is not top down, but it's now left to right. And it's emphasizing, and this is a Sukarno speech at Bandung that has been translated in Kwangming Daily. So with the unmaking of the Asian world, and this happens by the end of the decade, 59 to 1962, with the external forces, and this is why the concept of Asia is so problematic. I think it's not limited to Asia. The unmaking of Asia and the making of Asia connected to other parts of the world. In this case, we have Soviet Union and the United States playing their own roles, and the background is, of course, the Cold War here, and they play an important role. The nation states then create a problem for the migrant communities. I think this is one of the less research aspect, how these nation states coming off of India, China, Indonesia has an impact on the migrant communities in these places with regard to their sense of belonging and loyalty. There is the issue of Tibet, and it's no longer just appropriate to blame the British. It's no more a British legacy. and the territorial claims of newly formed nation states, the PRC and the Republic of India. These all become the reasons why the unmaking of the reality and the rhetoric of Asia starts to collapse. And this is again now reflected in Blitz. Blitz was one of the very pro-PRC newspapers in India. And by 1959, 60, 62, it totally changes. The narrative is very much anti-China. And it changes from Asia's newspaper to India's greatest newspaper. The nationalism comes to fore at this point. You see something similar in the Kwame Daily as well, where the Indians are being criticized across from 1959 onward, 1960 and 1962. But this is also reflected in other publications. And this is one comic book from China that talks about 1954-55, when an exhibition took place in Bombay and how the Chinese exhibitor, along with the Indians, ganged up against a British imperialist industrialist. The Indians also produced a very interesting movie. The story was written in 1940s. It became a film in 1950s. Under the Blue Sky, it's about a platonic love story between a Chinese migrant and an Indian woman in Calcutta. And this was basically how China and India looked like in the 1950s. But that narrative changes. And then we have in 1962-63, a comic book about a Chinese hero who fought the Indians and died fighting the Indians. The same thing happens in India. The narrative changes, and this is a Bollywood film that is about fighting the Chinese. So between 1950s and 1960s, the narrative totally changes. The Asian world really never comes true. So we see again this fact repeated over and over again. The military ideology of Japan leading to the collapse of Okakura's vision, Tibet resulting in the failure of Nehru's vision, and that actually takes place in 1947 Asian Relations Conference itself. Territorial conflict that results in disintegration of the Asian world, the Panchshil collapses. But what it does, and this is what I've been interested in, how all these have an impact on the civil society dialogue and imagination of an Asian world. And I think this is reflected in the publications that I've been looking at. So by 1962, the reality and the rhetoric of Asianism totally collapses. So I'll end with 3 points here. Looking at the narratives of Asianism, starting with Okakura 1950s and the present 21st century, the centrality is given to China and India pairing. I think that is quite problematic because these two nation states have their own problems. And then when we talk about China, India of the past, I think that narrative of a historical Buddhist connection is also more of an imagination rather than a reality. The other issue I wanted to emphasize, especially for this conference, is that when we look at world making, the unmaking is also quite important because when I do connections, I see that disconnections are equally important to understand connections. So I think with regard to the making of a world, the process of unmaking is also important to understand. And finally, this is connecting to what Barbara appropriately criticized, Chen Guangxian's idea about Asia as method. So can Asia, which struggles to be one, be a method even during a phase of de-imperialization, which Chen Guangxian emphasizes? Chen Guangxian is related to the West Heavens initiative that Barbara mentioned, and he also has pointed out something called India's method, urging Chinese scholars to not look at the Western methods, but look at India as a method to study China. I'll end with that for you to figure out if that is appropriate or not. Thank you. Well,
thank you very much for sharing your rich ideas with us. And I think, I mean, the theme of unmaking will be particularly important for this afternoon session because, well, we will discuss the implications of the war in Ukraine as a moment that is presumably unmaking much of global, European, and maybe even regional order in Asia, in parts of Asia, as we know it. And a thinker who has been ruminating and reflecting upon patterns of making and unmaking and articulations of Asian connections for a significant amount of time and has published great works on that is Professor Selçuk Esenbel. She's a professor emerita of Japanese and Asian history at the Department of History at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And she's also the founding director and current academic coordinator of the Asian Studies Center in Istanbul. And she received her college education in the United States and graduated with a PhD from Columbia University. And she published widely on relations between Japan and Turkey and Japanese agency in different parts of Asia, including West Asia. And one more recent book just published a couple of years ago that she edited and that was widely reviewed is Japan on the Silk Road, especially in the modern Silk Road, Encounters and Perspectives of Politics and Culture. And she received numerous awards. I mean, the special award of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, the Imperial Order of the Rising Sun, and the Georg Foster Award of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And the last of these awards that also has brought her to Göttingen already several times. So Selçuk, we're very glad that you're here and looking forward to your talk.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be in this very exciting conference, and I would like to thank Dominique and Janice and everybody, you know, for organizing it. Truly, you don't know how refreshing it is to get out of Istanbul at the moment. Just read the primetime press and you'll get my meaning. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to, you know, promise something which is very significant by any means, or I'm not so sure that, you know, it even has any conceptual contribution. I'm a historian, and I'm just observing what's happening. So it's just sort of like observation of what's happening in Japan since the post-Cold War period and today's Ukraine crisis. And as you said so wisely, it is truly the unmaking of something. But it's too early to tell, but it's kind of worrying, definitely. Indeed, on the screen, as you can see, I found this map from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. It's the most detailed one that I have discovered for the free and open Indo-Pacific proposal. If you're following Japanese foreign policy, statements of, you know, prime ministers, foreign ministers, you know, the sort of talking heads of Japan Times, if you will, you'll see that this is sort of, they're engaged with this, you know, free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, whatever, you know, acronym you want to use. And this is pretty much in detail. So it's kind of like the latest 2022 map. And as you can see, the map includes not only the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, but interestingly enough, as you can see, it includes Africa. This is something new that should be noticed. And it certainly includes India. It includes the coastal area of China. So China is not completely out of it. It is supposed to be an economic multi-zone vision, so to speak. On April 8th, 2022, just about a couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Suzuki Kazuhiro of Japan in Ankara, Turkey, he gave a talk where he appealed to Turkey for joining the free and open Indo-Pacific as the future of the 21st century. Just sorry about the mistake. And as you know, on February 24, 2022, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine had accelerated the significance of the free and open concept. And one can easily see the end to Japan's traditional pacifist foreign policy. In other words, in 2-3 weeks, suddenly the language in Japan has started changing and moving away from the more, you know, mainstream language of, well, we need to revise the constitution, but, you know, we want to stay pacifist as well because it's safer, it's better, etc., and so on. This is a vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific region. According to the MOFA argument, ASEAN, which as you know, Japan pays great attention to ASEAN, is at the core of this new global, multi-regional, free trade zone, but also political and maybe by implication military, if you will, cooperation zone. From ASEAN, the connections are made to India, to China, to Africa, and to, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. So it's a kind of American, African, Asian, if you will, three-continent combination. Now, according to Ambassador Suzuki's evaluation, and I think it's interesting that he projected this rhetoric to a Turkish audience, you know, which would be different than, say, maybe the ambassador. If he was speaking here, maybe he would use slightly different terminology. Well, that's diplomacy. He claimed that by 2050, the top economies of the world will be centered in Asia. And that Asia will manufacture 50% of the global economy. So that's the basic premise of the so-called FOIP. It's going to be the center of the global economy. And that there will be a radical shift in the top 10 economies of the world today. Certainly the rise of China will be in step with the ascendancy of Asia's century. I've always noticed this, by the way, when I listen carefully to Japanese diplomats. We know of course, the conflictual language that sometimes arises between China and Japan over various historical issues, the Senkaku Islands and Diaoyu Island, you know, contestation and so on. But when diplomats speak, it's amazing. They are, let me put it this way, they are very respectful in their presentation of the rise of China, unlike American diplomats, who sort of usually will use a threatening language, you know, sort of rise of China and all that, you know, kind of like turning it into a sort of aggressive dragon. The Japanese diplomats are very careful to use a very respectful language saying this was inevitable. Because the rise of Asia is where it's at, and of course China is now, you know, moving it with Asia together. So from the Japanese perspective, maybe this is a kind of little legacy, hidden legacy of their pre-war Asianism we were talking about. They sort of speak about it in a kind of happy terms, you know? They say, yeah, well, this is what it should have been, and so it's happening. It's very different than the language of American diplomats, for example, if you hear them simultaneously. And that Italy, Spain, Canada, Russia will descend below the top 10 economies. I thought it was interesting that he included Russia there. This is different than the World Bank data. For example, I looked at the World Bank data. It still includes Russia in 2050, but the Japanese MOFA data has deleted it for some reason. And Turkey and Indonesia will enter into the top 10, so why don't you join the Indo-Pacific Ocean now? You know, you're just, you know, on the way, kind of. And that the growth of Africa will influence the future. This is something very new and novel, hearing it from a Japanese diplomat. I've just simply taken this, you know, from the ministry's page. It's the English version. Note, please, the vocabulary, the emphasis of the vocabulary that emerges in this text about, you know, FOIP as global strategy. Rule of law, this is sort of like repeated. It's kind of like a mantra, if you will. Freedom, freedom of navigation, market economy, prosperity, connectivity through quality infrastructure. Now that's a kind of like a criticism implicitly of, I think, Chinese infrastructure, you know, projects saying, well, we can do the same, but even better. Kind of, that's the Japanese claim. Securing peace and stability. In other words, rather than transforming the world order, the idea here is let's move gradually into this evolutionary process by securing peace and stability. At this point, though, when you compare to, for example, 10 years ago, I follow MOFA quite regularly. They had a similar kind of argument. They called it the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity. It was a different vision, and it remained a vision. There was nothing substantial in it. But the Indo-Pacific vision now does have JICA projects. In other words, since Prime Minister Abe Shinzo came up with this, he's also come up with the cash. In other words, they are bringing in money into Africa. They're bringing in money, especially to Myanmar, to Bangladesh, to India, various projects, just like the Belt and Road Initiative. You can see that it's kind of like trying to compete with it by saying, well, we can also construct ports. We can construct railways too. We can bring in money to cash-hungry economies, that need it, and so on. So it's clearly now being forged with some budget allocation. Certainly, I've traced the roots of it back to 1996, because we see this language first emerge in the Japan-US Joint Declaration on Security Alliance for the 21st Century. It's an important declaration because it's a text in Japanese-US relations that did, at least at the rhetorical level, transform the 1960 US-Japan Security Treaty into an alliance. So the term now used is an alliance. That comes out very strongly in this declaration. So Japan and United States are treated equally in the discursive level, rather than Japan being dependent totally on, US nuclear power and US defense presence in East Asia, as would be the case for the 1960 Security Treaty, if you read it carefully. The language is somewhat different, certainly. It used to be much more security-oriented. This is much more alliance-oriented. And the terms already in this text of, freedom, rule of law, prosperity, sharing values, this is something absolutely new that comes out, was already forged in that text. The first kind of, experiment with it, it started in 2006 with Foreign Minister, later Prime Minister Aso Taro, when he came up with the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity. It's kind of like the first experiment with this idea of the Cold War is finished, the security treaty in itself is no longer sufficient, we're turning it into an alliance, but it has to be an alliance with a global appeal. So what can it be? The Arc of Freedom and Prosperity didn't last long. Aso Taro lost the elections and he resigned in 2007, so that was the end of the Arc. But if you want to look at it, I finally found this from his publication, which is actually, Aso Taro loves manga and anime. He's a foreign minister, so he's sort of like an avid follower. So his publisher is a manga publisher. So if he publishes anything on foreign policy, you've got to go to the manga stores, to get it. It's a kind of crazy guy. Really. Interesting, eccentric soul. But anyway, this arc, his, first claim, as you can see, United Asia, it starts with, Japan, kind of goes through, a little bit more north of the Indian and Pacific Ocean, not down to Africa, but it includes the Near East, the Balkans, and finally reaches Western Europe. So it was truly a Euro-Asian kind of, but more maritime, if you will, conceptualization. It didn't get anywhere. This is another map of it. But what is important about all of this experimentation, it seems to me, as a historian, is that it is the end to the Yoshida Shigeru system of the 1950s, 60s, the heyday of the Cold War, where Prime Minister Yoshida, who was in charge of adapting occupation, the reforms, and finally the signature of the Treaty of San Francisco for the independence of Japan, his speech, this is from his speech to the Diet, to the parliament, where he says, forget about being a Dai Nippon Teikoku. Just forget it. It's gone. It's finished. It collapsed. It was a disaster. But from now on, he says, we will be a Keizai Taikoku, okay? Economy will be the root for Japanese power. So this is the future. Pretty much you can say that Japan's extraordinary emphasis on economic, prosperity, growth, the development, high development, project of the 1960s, double income policy, all of that is kind of connected to this vision of we will be an economic power because the other routes are no longer valid. It also weakens, I think, the post-Cold War new, debate. It weakens the Cold War Japanese attitude towards, okay, they're dependent on the United States, the US, security treaty. But, Japanese businessmen, by the way, this is probably not very well known, I think, in the international press, were always pro-China. In other words, we know that they actually conducted trade with China via third parties, despite the Cold War and anti-communist rhetoric of the heyday of the 50s and 60s. They probably did it through Hong Kong, I think. So there did develop within the, mainstream right-wing politicians this term of seikei bunri. In other words, economics is economics, politics is politics. We may be against communism, we may be dependent totally on the US for our political, regime, but economically, we have to, have relations with China independent of that. It's a kind of sort of hybrid, pragmatic attitude. Well, that seems to be weakening at this point, in the post-Cold War period. Unlike Asotaro's, arc of freedom, the free and open Indo-Pacific restricts the region. It kicks out Europe. The Middle East is out, the Balkans is out. It is strictly focused on Asia, America, and Africa. This is new. And there's great lengthy discussion in this map about, how Africa will be the future, how it's a young population, how it will be a very fertile ground for investment. In other words, drawing our attention to the future of Africa next to Asia. And then there's also a third current Japanese geopolitical vision, which is in competition with what I have just summarized for you. But right now, because of the Ukraine crisis, unfortunately, it has retreated to the background. And that third vision, or the second vision, if you will, is East Asian community. In other words, it's a second tier of Japan's diplomacy geared towards the region. The East Asian community strategy has ASEAN, but it also has the concept of mutual cooperation with the People's Republic of China. So it's ASEAN, China, and we in the region cooperate with each other because we are mutually dependent on each other. You shouldn't think that that vision has disappeared. It's there. And sometimes it'll come out quite surprisingly. For example, Abe Shinzo is the one who gave headaches to people because of all his nationalist pronouncements, sort of like Japan has to be now much more patriotic. Japan has to be more militarily, capable. But then suddenly in 2018, he picked up a whole, airplane full of Japanese businessmen and flew to Beijing, shocking Washington, by the way, in the meantime. And there, when you look at his, speeches, his declarations, it's this East Asian community. We have our, interaction. So let's not sever it completely. Japanese politicians and diplomats will come up with this line every so often when things seem just a little too dangerous. It's a discrete argument emphasizing the East Asian cultural bonds from history, known before the war as the Dobun Doshu, or we belong to the same writing orbit, the same written culture, and we are the same type of people. It's not really a racial, by the way, argument, as sometimes it's translated. It's more like, we're kindred, we're the same kind of people. So we should be in cooperation with each other. So that's kind of like, unfortunately, at this moment, it's receded into the background. My assessment, very quickly, I find this free and open Indo-Pacific geographical space strikingly similar to the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 that lasted until 1922. it's the same geography. A kind of, as a geopolitical strategic vision, it sounds very much like the maritime power principle of Mahanism of the late 19th century of the American naval officer Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued for the importance of the control of the seas for the future of a global power competition. Now, Mahanism is very influential in Japan, by the way. All Japanese businessmen will read a kind of translation of his text. I mean, it's a popular work. And so, to me, it implicitly, this vision challenges the counter-argument of a Eurasian hinterland power of Russia and China. It never says it. But you can see the people who are writing up this map, who are dotting up, Japanese sort of connections there to projects, this and that, and of course, military, collaboration with India and with Australia, it's in their mind. They're not going to say it, but it's in their mind. So it looks very much like, the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And curiously enough, I discovered an analogy from an American paper, which is actually, it was published in the year 2000 from the Institute of National Strategic Studies, National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and the paper's title is The United States and Japan Advancing Toward a Mature Partnership. It's a special report of top politicians, top academics, top, diplomats of the day in United States. And the report notes on page 3 that we need to evolve, transform our security treaty into a very strong, proactive alliance between the United States and Japan, because this is necessary for the 21st century, and that it should be a special relationship like that between the United States and Great Britain that should serve as a model. So indeed, and I do know for a fact that, within Japanese diplomacy, there's a great nostalgia for the Anglo-Japanese alliance. I mean, it's very much a Ministry of Foreign Affairs vision. Final point. Limits of strategic visions and the Ukraine crisis. The very same report that I just cited for you, the American report, Great Britain analogy, it says on page 1, a major war in Europe is inconceivable for at least a generation, and that the prospects for conflict in Asia is imminent. That major conflict could occur any moment on the Korean Peninsula, in the Taiwan Strait. The Indian subcontinent is a flashpoint. Lingering turmoil, whatever that means, in Indonesia, threatens Southeast Asia. So, in other words, war will never happen in Europe again, at least for one long generation. Okay, it's been only 20 years since the year 2000. What do we have? No major wars in Asia, as far as I know. There might be threatening situations, but no major wars. But the Ukraine crisis has opened up the danger of a major war immediately in Europe within one generation, or even half a generation. So don't trust strategic reports, and the strategic mind is what I would say. My maybe final sentence, if I may. The impact in Japan, of course, is very, worrying, because the press is full of, we have to inculcate patriotism within the young generation to fight as bravely as the Ukrainians. The Japanese government has fully entered into the system of sanctions, and they did something unprecedented. The Japanese government is very public about no refugee policy. No refugees. They've just deleted that, article from their regulations. Unconditional refugee policy for Ukrainians. They can go to Japan. It reminds me so much of how the Japanese imperial government gave unconditional refugee status to white Russians and to Tatars escaping from the Bolshevik Revolution and that conflict in Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for this enticing talk. I think it's probably no coincidence that two or actually three of our panelists so far talk very much about Japan, right? So I think over the past years, when we talk about East Asia, we have paid so much attention on the rise of China, and Japan has been somewhat in the shadow. And I think that is changing both in the field of East Asian studies, but also in the wider public discourse. But now we'll switch to our next speaker. This is Professor Fan Xin from the State University of New York at Fredonia. He's an associate professor of history there, and he will also spend some time in Cambridge in the near future. His research areas include Chinese intellectual history, especially history of historiography and global history. And his most recent work is a monograph on world history and national identities in China, the 20th century, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. And he also co-edited a volume, I think together with Hanse Chi, right? Hanse Chi? Oh yeah, right. Okay, yeah. So with on reception of Greek and Roman antiquity in East Asia, which was published by Brill Publishers, and he's going to talk about well, the Thucydides trap, and also remind us that visions of unmaking order are a little bit older than the February 24th crisis. Thank you. Thucydides trap right now. Yeah?
I'll do that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction by Dominic, and thank you very much for Jenny's invitation to this big event. It's very exciting. As Dominic introduced, I'm a historian of intellectual history and historiography. So for me, it's really excited to have this opportunity to have a conversation and dialogues from scholars from other fields. It seems that so far, this conference, many participants are very much into sort of discussion of a methodology, right? World as a method, Asia as a method. I guess for me, as a historian of historiography, if I could say my method, I guess I'm trying to argue that in this research project, I'm going to use historiography as a method. I'm going to use historiography to have a broader and bigger conversation with the scholars of international relations and political theories. It's really interesting because we just had a presentation. Professor Inzabal just mentioned this analogy, the Great Britain analogy in Japan today. And we're living in this modern world, and we just realized the world is full of analogies. And just look at the field of China studies, there's so many analogies, right? The Gilded Age in China, the Red Revolution, the Green Revolution, the new Cold War. And in the United States, the political right are actually talking about a cultural revolution that is already taking place in the West, in their country. So this is my research focus. That is, on the one hand, we can see a lot of people are using historical analogies. On the other hand, it seems there's so little research about the topic. This is a project still ongoing, so I did a little literature survey, and I realized the last great work on this topic in the field of historiography was published in 1970. And of course, this is criticized, right? So David Hector Fisher, in his book, he criticizes people, how people abuse the term, right? The idea of historical analogy. And he concludes there are 7 ways for people to make mistakes when they are using historical analogy. It is understandable because historical analogy are often about the things similar but not the same. And people sometimes use historical analogy, but they assume the 2 things in comparison are actually the same. So it's an easy mistake for people to make. And it's important for us to acknowledge this point, and because this fallacy, the possible fallacy, allows us to have a very complicated conversation regarding the use and abuse of a historical analogy. And on this topic, I did a little research. So a couple of years, 2 years ago, I published an entry for the Bloomsbury history, theory, and method. And I wrote an article about the use of historical analogy. So I'm trying to look at the sense of time, the conscious of time, and the use of historiology. So basically, I am trying to argue that before the modern era, there's a strong assumption that history repeats itself, right? Historical analogy, in a way, are the things that are happening again. But after the French Revolution, entering into the modern times, people seem to develop a more and nuanced consciousness regarding historical analogy. A lot of people would argue, well, history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And that's something that I've already done a little, right, in terms of historical analogy as a historiographical question. But the next question I feel is more important when it comes to the conversation like this. That is, we have historical analogy. But why do we embrace certain historical analogies and reject the others? So in other words, from the functionality of historical analogy, my current project is looking into the reception of historical analogies. And of course, this research project is taking place in the broader framework of world making. And here I did a little research about the world making. And for me, the concept is a little bit trouble because it's very elusive. That is, on the one hand, when we're talking about world making, it allows us to look at many things from a new perspective. But on the other hand, as a historian, I'm not very much comfortable saying this is world making. So in what way are we talking about world making? And of course, especially if we look at the standard book from international political theory, for example, Adam Gatachu's world making after empire. In the whole book, she doesn't talk about what really world making means, right? So that's a thing that we have to think about. And of course, as a historian of historiography, I'm trying to argue that at least what I'm trying to do here is looking at world making as a process that is taking place at the level of consumption. That is, when we are talking about the world is not only a concept of space, but also a concept of time. World is world history in making. So in a way, when I'm looking at this, I'm adopting a world historical perspective. And of course, scholars have done this before. For example, Professor Conrad has already written a book about what is global history. So for me, I'm not going to talk about how to identify the general patterns. I'm not going to talk about how to grasp the principles or making connections or making comparisons. But in my research, I'm curious about what is the role of historical analogies in making world history. And in this case, I'm looking at the way in which people are bringing things from different times and space together by referring to historical analogy. In other words, historical analogy creates connection and allows us to look at things from different times, different spaces together. And here in this project, I'm looking at the use and abuse of historical knowledge through this comparative perspective. That is, on the one hand, I'm looking at how the historical knowledge about the ancient China having international relations does not work. People reject, neglect, overlook this idea. In comparison to another historical analogy about how the idea, the concepts, the experience of ancient Greece could work for us. So you can see, right, the lessons, the analogies from ancient China does not work for us. But the analogies from ancient Greece works for us. So we have to think about in what sort of situation are we looking at the same issue of ancient world analogy to the contemporary society. And of course, here I have two examples. One example is the idea of ancient China as the modern world. I think Professor Wang Hui, in his keynote speech, had already introduced the WAT marking. In the 1870s, he translated the international law into Chinese. But later, in 1881, he visited Germany and he participated in the Berlin Congress of Orientalists. And in the conference, he delivered a paper. In that paper, he argued that in ancient China, there existed an international system, international law. And in fact, international law is never alien and foreign to China. So this ancient China is talking about the spring and autumn period in China, roughly from 7th century BCE to 4th century BC. 5th century BC. And of course, this is one argument, right? So this is the historical analogy of the ancient China to the modern international order. And the other analogy, I think this is something that we're all familiar with. That is from Graham Allison, talking about the Thucydides tribe. I'm sorry, I have a bit difficult pronouncing this name. Right? Thucydides tribe. Right? I'm trying. Right? So basically, the argument is the ancient wisdom from Greece will help us to predict the future. The inevitable conflict between the United States and China. Why? Because the argument is the international order should be based on the balance of power. Once this balance breaks, it's going to be a war. And of course, I'm talking about this historical analogy from China. And this historical analogy in China is actually very popular, long existing. And I did a little preliminary research on this issue based on the scholarship from China. We can see over the course of the entire 20th century, many international relations scholars in China are adopting similar idea. Not just in the PRC, but in the Republican period as well. You can see a list of scholars. However, I think for most of us, if we're not doing research on this topic, this idea is little known to us. By contrast, right, when we're talking about the analogy from ancient Greece to the modern world, Graham Allison's work, it becomes so popular and so heavily discussed even in China. And in fact, in 2015, when Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, I think you know him, right, visited the United States for the first time for the first time and the only time as a state visit, he actually talked about Thucydides tribe. And he, in his keynote speech delivered to the business leaders in the local community in Seattle, he actually made a clear reference to the thesis, to the Thucydides trap. And he says there's no such thing called a Thucydides trap in the world in the first place. Yet, if misjudgments occurred among great nations, they would set up the Thucydides trap for themselves. And this sort of a conversation creates lots of fanfare in China. And this is what I'm talking about, the historiography as a method. So in my own research, I'm examining the writings about this idea, Thucydides trap, in China by looking at public intellectuals and historians, professional historians. And here, my position is not criticize these scholars. In other words, I'm an observer, right? I'm a historiographer. I'm looking at how these scholars reject, oppose the idea of a Thucydides trap from the Chinese perspective. And here, I'm going to give you two case studies. One is the ultra-nationalistic public intellectual called He Xin. And in a book that he published is called A Critical Study of the Fabricated History of Greece. He basically dismisses the entire history of the ancient Greece. And let me just read one paragraph from the text so you have a sense of the idea. He says, I'll say that in Chinese first and I'll read that in English translation. He says, 历史学家都知道，研究历史、讲述历史，首先应当考定和正信史料。而关于希腊史令人震惊的事实就是 ，so here， 所有描述希腊历史的西方史料，既不是来自希腊，也不是第一手的直接史料，甚至多数不是用希腊文写成的。And here is the punchline. 希腊史就是一个完全没有原始史料的传说故事。So let me translate it into English, my poor translation, bear with it. Historians all know, to study history, to tell history, one has to critically examine historical sources. The shocking truth is all the historical records that describe Greek history are neither from Greece nor first-handed primary sources. Most are not even written in Greek. Greek history is legendary story in total absence of primary sources. So you can see as an ultra-nationalistic public intellectual in China, He Xin criticized the Thucydides trap. But the way in which he does it is a total deny the very existence of the entire history of ancient Greece. So this is one example. And the other example from a professional historian, a professor teaching at Fudan University, and she's a scholar of foreign historiography. So this is a professional historian. And so her work is really based on solid research. And in this work, a published article in 2017, she brings us two critical issues when we are looking at the idea of a Thucydides trap. One is she argues that among professional historians, even in the West, nobody would argue for the inevitability of war. So in other words, for the professional Greek historians, when they are looking at the outbreak of war between ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta, they are looking at contingent factors. And this is a professional view, not just in China, but also from the West. So that's the first argument. Under the second argument, she's educating Western scholars, saying these Western international theorists, political scientists, they haven't studied ancient Greek history that much. So they all got it wrong. And of course, these are two examples, right? But if we look at these two examples and situate these two examples within the bigger picture of the atmosphere of opinion, we can draw three quick conclusions. One is, when we're looking at this sort of conversation, do we see xenophobia? Not really. Because even this ultra-nationalistic guy, he's now saying ancient and foreign history is irrelevant. He's actually spending the time writing an entire book, right, talking about ancient Greek history, even though he's trying to say that's wrong, that's a fake. He's still doing it, right? He's actually studying ancient Greek history. He's investing into it. He feels the relevance of it. So Chinese xenophobia? No. Chinese nationalism? Yes. And perhaps. Because for this guy, He Xin, he's ultra-nationalist. We all know it. We can definitely see it. But for professional historians in China, not necessarily are they basing their decision and position from a nationalistic perspective. And they're actually trying to have an academic conversation based on professional studies. So that is a maybe. And then the Chinese complex for antiquity. My answer is absolutely yes. Because despite all the fanfare, the conversation still evolves the relationship, the historical knowledge from the ancient world to the modern China, right? So you can see historical analogy is connecting in a way, it's contributing to the formation of modern Chinese identity. So here, give you one last example. And here, let me return to my assertion, historiography as a method. That is, a couple of days ago, Xi Jinping participated in this collective study session of the Chinese CCP Politburo. And in that study section, he actually delivered a talk saying that if the Chinese history goes back, how many years we're looking at? 1 million years of mankind history in China, and 10,000 years of cultural history in China, and 5,000 years of civilizational history in China. So when we're looking at this, we just couldn't help but wonder, right? What's this? The state initiative of engineering the Chinese identity is not just a political and historical project. It is actually a historiographical project. And this brings back the relevance of historiography. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Xin, for sharing your ideas and analogies with us. And so I'm very glad that you brought up the topic of analogies, because I think it goes very well with the other presentations in this panel. They were partly talking about analogies, but also partly talking about a slightly different phenomenon, right? Which you could describe as maybe a purported or willful reconnecting with earlier discourses. And when we talk about the East Asian community or an Asian century or so, these are recurrent themes that people are trying to connect with them. And that's like maybe a related category, but not entirely related to the same as the analogies. But what they have in common, and I think that goes so well together here, is that this is exactly where interpretations, narratives, and maybe then real claims to power come together. And I think that was actually the part of this entire public section, maybe even of the conference at large, to look at where ideas, worldviews on one side, claims to power, articulations of power, and shifts of power come together. And I think that's what we want to do, especially this afternoon, is also looking at problems that are related to IR and security studies and so forth, but look at them through the lenses from intellectual history, that we don't let fields like IR and other strategically oriented fields have a monopoly on, well, the topics and themes that are dealing with global futures, and especially in a broader sense, but also global securities. So thanks a lot for all 4 presentations, and we have still some time for discussions. So yeah, Tang Chenxi, yeah. You would have to wait for the mic because of the online audience. Yeah, so, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you all for this very thought-provoking presentations. So as the audience member, I do have a feeling that these 4 presentations somehow really add up to a big picture. And this is not always the case, I think, at conferences. So I have a comment or question actually to all, so whoever wants to answer. So first of all, so the topic of this panel is Asia. So Asia is a Greek concept. So it is a Greek concept that took shape around 500 BCE and was elaborated by tragedians like Aeschylus and by historians like Herodotus. So it became really part of the concept of Asia became part of European intellectual history through the ancient Greeks. Now, when Japan, at the turn of the 20th century, took up this concept, it was actually took up European discourse system, took up a European concept, and in so doing took up the European discourse system. So in actually, speaking of Asia as one, as Okakura Tenshin does, he's actually saying, I'm looking at the world in the same way as Europeans look at it. Even in actually arguing against Europe by opposing Asia to Europe, is the Asianists were actually repeating Europe because the opposition between Europe and Asia was already actually the main part, the crux of the concept of Europe in ancient Greece. So in that sense, when this Ito Chuta is really very interesting by claiming descent or connection to Greece, he is really the very figure, the very symbol of Asianism, exactly by establishing this connection back to Europe, to Greece. So I thought very interesting. Now, to the second paper, to Sen's paper. So when Sen when you came to the conclusion that Asia is not one, the unmaking of this very Asianist ideas, I think what it means actually is Europe has disappeared, or Europe is out of the picture. And what is the result when Europe drops out of the picture? That's geopolitics. I think that would be really kind of the essence of the third paper. That's Professor Essen-Bell. That so basically you mentioned Mehan, you mentioned kind of the classical geopolitical opposition to sea power and land power, Britain, Japan on the one hand, China and Russia on the other. So, and that is actually also kind of, I think, the gist of maybe, well, that's what the Thucydides trap is really about. So in a certain sense, I just really, maybe I'm kind of, as a literary scholar, is really constructing a narrative, but I do see a narrative here that is really kind of this grand arc, right? It's a narrative arc from Asianism, from the kind of the import and reputation of European discourse to kind of the rise of a new era in which Europe entirely symbolically, unfortunately sometimes also kind of not so symbolically, but realistically have dropped partly out of the picture. And we come into this geopolitical reality of great power competition. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, Igor Severna.
Many thanks for these brilliant presentations. I would have 2 questions and a comment for Seljuk. So I found your speech very interesting, talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, because I think, as you've also mentioned, most of us probably only heard about it when the US used it as sort of an argument or a mechanism to constrain or even contain China. And as you have presented it, I found it very interesting. Do you see it as sort of a counterweight or a competition to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative at all, or is it more conceptual? And then the other question is, I know you're a historian, but maybe you can speculate just a little bit. How do you see the chances of success for the free and open Indo-Pacific, given that it's kind of indirect juxtaposition to the Chinese core interests in the South China Sea? Isn't it simply creating more frictions over time? And can it be successful without aligning China in the interests? So,
we're just collecting the 3, and then there's.
Could I forgot my comment. Sorry, just quickly. And my other comment is because Seljuk also said that Europe is kind of left aside, right? Just a comment, because I think France and the UK, but also Germany recently has pronounced that they are all Indo-Pacific powers as well. So just a small comment.
Thank you. Okay, before we have the first round of answers, there's Bettina Granzo. It's up here in the front. This is.
Yeah, thank you for great presentations. I have a question for Sebastian Konrad. So I was reminded when I heard your presentation about Ito Chuto to Liang Zisheng in China, architecture historian. And this was a bit different story because he just studied in the US and then came back and used the methods he had learned to look into the architecture history of pagodas and temples and so on. And there was also this was also a nationalist undertaking, but quite different. And so on the one hand, I was wondering about the networks, for example, whether these two persons knew each other or not. And on the other hand, whether it would make sense from a comparative perspective to look into different Asian architecture historians and how they dealt with the question of Asia.
Thank you. Yeah. So maybe we'll just answer in the order that you spoke.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll just take this up as a suggestion because obviously it would be very interesting to do that, both simply because it would be illuminating to look at the various ways in which people, architects say, strategically used these notions, but also for the reason that you mentioned, the concept of Asia, which links your question to the comment by Tang Chenxi. Yes, so Partha Chatterjee once phrased this as, this is a derivative discourse. They fight against the colonizer, but they use the colonizer's tools, which means the concepts that are essentially European. And I think that's a very powerful framework. But maybe two caveats, and this will be sort of two ways to complicate the story here. One is, it wasn't that obvious that Greece was the West. It wasn't certainly for the Mombosho. They thought Greece. It wasn't actually for Ito, who in his own vision, Greece was a source of inspiration for Europe and for Central Asia, like Syria and so forth. So that's, in other words, it wasn't very clear that it was simply the West. And in fact, I mean, if we go back to Winkelmann, for him, Greece was a way of showing that Germany wasn't like France, meaning Western. So in that sense, it's sort of a complicated story. I mean, just to add to what you said, because I think your comments were very spot on. And the second comment, the second aspect is, you're right, Herodotus, the term Asia goes back to Herodotus, and then it's probably introduced into China by Matteo Ricci, but it doesn't begin to make sense, I would argue, in East Asia until the end of the 19th century. And it's only when European empire and sort of capitalist intrusions into Asia turn Asia into an entity that makes geopolitical sense, is this term actually taken up. So therefore, there is this discursive history, but there's also a materialist history that helps us to understand why at a particular moment it registers as a category also in China or Japan. So just to add to, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It would be Tan Sen.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think the Partha Chatterjee quote is quite important. There's a forthcoming book by Niall Green called How Asia Found Herself, and he points out the use of the term Asia in vernacular languages, including Persian and Urdu and Bengali, before it gets to Okakura. I think he does a wonderful job of connecting the idea of Asia initially used in the context of Sebastian's quote on Partha Chatterjee. They are using the European model. But when it gets to the 1950s, I think Europe is out of the context, but US is back in the context. So it's the West So I think in the 21st century, again, it's not just Europe, it's the other parts that are not Asia. And the most interesting thing I find with regard to Asia in the 50s is the role of Africa. I think it's the connective part of Africa and Asia, which I think the Japanese are using, as was pointing out. It becomes an important part of understanding Asia, not Europe, but Africa. I think that's a very important stage in the 1950s. China is discovering it, Japan is discovering it, and India is discovering that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so Selçuk, so please. Yeah.
For your questions and comment, of course, in official discourse, they never target Russia or China. They don't say it by name. But with this constant emphasis on, international law, rules of law, emphasis on freedom, emphasis on, stability and so on, I mean, it's always implied. In other words, the text itself implies that it's kind of like free and open Indo-Pacific nations that will collaborate, and they've started to collaborate. They are moving towards a more desirable and, if you will, competitive economic and political, world making. In other words, if China and Russia are world making, so we are also world making. They don't say it, but you can read it in the text definitely. It depends. For example, like former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, whenever he's asked this question, he always says, he always said, well, China is welcome as long as, China sort of goes along with the principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific, that sort of set of principles. China is fine. And in fact, we can work in some projects together. So it's not contestational, it's competitive, I think, very much so. And the contestation would be in the background, in the mind of the policymakers. I think that as to whether this is going to increase competition or rivalry or tension, I don't know about that because, this is not just the Japanese are thinking this way. I mean, there are also, invitations, for example, from Malaysia or from some countries along the coast of East Africa, African countries. So there are countries, I think, in this whole, multi-oceanic region who would sort of say, well, the Chinese are coming with their Belt and Road initiative, but there are some issues that Sri Lanka has shown, about the loan trap, this and that. So, in fact, there's also a kind of pressure on Japan, like say, well, why don't you come out here? I mean, and why don't you also present an alternative, competitive, project for infrastructure? So there's, I think, also a degree of invitation, from different circles in that region, I should say. So it's all out in the air, I mean, and the Ukraine crisis is accelerating it. This is what I'm saying. It's just accelerating it. Europe is out. It's interesting. It was in the first vision, but it's out, but it's kind of like, well, we're doing this here. And if European Union wants to connect it in some way, that's fine. But, our focus is on, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And of course, that doesn't mean Asia necessarily alone. It means also the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and now the UK. So you might think that it's a kind of Anglo-Asian, hemisphere that is sort of being imagined at the moment. That's why I say it's like the, Anglo-Japanese alliance. It reminds me of that very much.
Sure. I guess, how do I put this? Because here, when we're talking about the invention of the concept of Asia, or this vicious cycle between Asia as a center or Europe as a center, it seems that oftentimes we overlook the complicated process of the formation of concept. So just use one example. If you look at Herodotus, indeed he mentioned the term Asia, and a lot of people would criticize him for being Eurocentric. But the entire book is actually a history about the rise of the Persian Empire. So in that case, it's not necessarily 100% Eurocentric back then. And there's layers of later generation interpretations. And using my own case study as example, the idea, the assertion that ancient China had international law, this idea I mentioned, W.T. Martin presented in Berlin in 1881. But he came up with this idea through his collaborator, who is Chinese. And later, He Bing-song, if you know this guy, he's a famous world historian. He copied W.A.T's idea in his MA thesis for Princeton University. So basically, he plagiarized the idea. So it's who comes to the idea first, because W.A.T. Martin, he wrote about it, but he wrote about it through his collaborator, who is Chinese. And then later, the Chinese scholar would copy the same idea from American missionary. And then all the way to today, Yan Xuetong will be talking about it. So I guess for us, when we're looking at the formation or the rise of the idea like Asia or the West, we are really looking at the layers of process of formation. It's not one individual story. It is not about who invented what first. If we're playing this game, we're always going to lose because this is a vicious cycle. So that's what I'm thinking.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so next round question was first you, then you, and then look at it. Yeah, right. We have a whole triangle up there. Okay.
Yes, thanks for all the lectures. A thought, it might extend to a question, we'll see. So I think it's interesting how the connection between analogies and nationalism appear in different papers, either rejected by nationalism or used if we identify what Professor Conrad talked about as analogies as well, used to bolster nationalism. And I'm just wondering about the third option. So we know, at least in the early May 4th, if we connect it to the point of science, especially in relation to art or aesthetics, analogies or learning from the other can also be a way to eradicate borders, entities, right, subject, object, in this, if you think Chai Yuanpei or some other thinkers. So I'm just interested to know the tension, perhaps, if you think about the point of science and the point of nationalism, and do we have some of this tension also extending to later periods? I don't know if that's something you would want to comment upon. Thanks.
Okay, if you want to just pass it on. Yeah.
Yes, I got a question to Professor Frank Hien. You were talking about the Thucydides trap and the Chinese rejection of it. How does it relate to the Chinese domestic historical analogies, like, for instance, that of the warring states?
Thank you so much for all the presentation. My question goes to Sebastian Conrad. I thought it was a really interesting case on Ito Chito, how he is traveling to Europe and like it's kind of like from east to west in this kind of explorer phase, where anyways there was also from Europe a lot of explorations or excursions happening to the east. And I was just kind of wondering, since we also heard it this morning, that there was also fascination of Asia happening in Europe at the same time. What was his reception, or was there some kind of discourse and dialogue happening when he arrived in Europe? Or was his kind of reports on his journeys mostly like going back to Japan, which you mentioned that I think when he was in China that he was writing this article. So I was kind of wondering if there was also in Europe kind of this transnational exchange happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe we'll take Kang before.
Thank you. I have one question for Selçuk, one for Fanxing. I find your description of the Japanese politicians and business attitudes toward China quite disturbing. I'm trying to figure out, you can enlighten us. There's a certain kind of pattern that underline this kind of Japanese thinking, you know, that they have all this Janus-faced double talk, you know, one on one hand, you know, want to do this good things to you, on the other hand, we see something else, in contrast to what you call this Anglo-American way of doing things. There's a heck of a lot of inconsistencies in what you describe as the sort of Japanese way of looking at China. I'm just trying to figure out, because I was really struck by your kind of commentary this morning that the Chinese would like to associate Muslim with anything when they deal with the Arab countries. How about the Italians using Catholic? So, you know, maybe this is something related. And for Fanxing, you know, I was also kind of disturbed by this possible discrepancies or chasm of the purposes of doing history. I think Xu Zhuoying sometimes said probably you have two different objectives of doing historical studies. One is to produce certain kind of justification or legitimacy, right? I mean, especially relevant to China, the Chinese system. I hear Wang Qishan saying, Wang Qishan, by the way, is kind of trained as a historian. He said, the legitimacy of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, derived from our history. I was a little shocked, but this is what he said in front of a group of people, maybe. Yeah, I was there. And so, and of course, there's Xu Zhuoying would argue history is not for legitimacy or whatever. History is to seek truth, which find out from all the labyrinth of historical events what is really truth. So I just want to hear your comment on this sort of discrepancy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we'll have another round of answers. Yeah, so should we go by the same order? That will be then Sebastian first. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, very quickly. I don't know whether your question was meant for everyone. I mean, I'd say the analogy in principle is open to any kind of strategic intervention. So if, to take an example from the German context, when the gay movement in the 1980s claimed the pink triangle that was used in the concentration camps, to make their case, they made an analogy that as a historian we would be very careful to make, but they made it very effectively as a political intervention to disrupt and to, just as you say, to disrupt borders and boundaries that were there in the first place. So I think it's in principle open. When Joschka Fischer said, never again Auschwitz in the context of the Yugoslavian war, you could draw any kind of conclusion. You could draw the conclusion that Germany had to intervene or not. So I think in principle they're open to any kind of political appropriation. Thank you, Antonia, for the question. The quick answer is no, zero reception. In fact, Ito claimed the discovery of the Yungan grottos, but since never anything that he published was translated into any other language, a couple of decades later, French scholars claimed to have discovered the Yungan grottos all over again, which essentially points to the asymmetries of knowledge production, obviously, in an age of empire, but also in our own. Yeah, so there's no access to what he said.
All right, next one will be Tansen.
Yeah, I just add what is quite interesting, both for the 19th century and in the 1950s, is about Asians writing about other parts of Asia. So in the second half of the 19th century, for example, there are Indians writing on Japan. They are Indians who were in Yokohama and Kobe. And I'm writing about Japan, which I think is quite fascinating. It's not from a European context. There's also an Indian soldier in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 writing about China. And the same thing is happening in the 1950s. So the discourse does not have to have the West in the context. And so the Asians writing about other parts of Asia, I think, is a fascinating way of looking at, and perhaps not doing West as a method, but looking at Asians speaking about each other, which I think is a fascinating new kind of topic to look at.
Thank you. And Selçuk.
About Japanese politicians double talk. Well, it's not. It sounds like double talk. You know, when I put the two projects, which seem to be quite competitive with each other, you know, in one kind of narrative, but it's public. In other words, if you look at Japan's, you know, blue books, this is exactly what they say. They'll say that our first principle is collaboration and dependency on the US security treaty. It's straightforward. And of course, FOIP, if you want to call it that, is under that, you know. And then they say the second principle, very important principle of Japan's foreign policy is East Asian regional friendship. Now, whether that second principle sounds as if it's contradictory to the first principle, let's put it this way. I mean, they're straightforward about it and say, in a way, the second principle, think of it this way, it kind of restricts the first one. In other words, the US alliance is central, but we don't want the Americans to get away with it completely, because we can at least also retreat to our regional connections. The Japanese think about this very clearly. For example, Japanese businessmen were very critical. Actually, they couldn't do anything about it when Japan had to, you know, recognize Taiwan and could not recognize the People's Republic of China. So they opened up venues of informal trade with China. They did it, you know, it's no secret. So it's not double talk. It's kind of like, for the Japanese, it has a kind of purpose for it. It restricts the first principle when you're regionalist, you know. It contains it. Both of them, they contain each other in a way.
Okay, see. Thanks a lot for these great questions. Due to the limit of time, I'm just going to quickly comment on these questions or try to provide a little answer. So I guess the first question here is, I agree with Sebastian that the historical analogies are never perfect. They're, according to Fisher, they are useful and heuristic tools for the purpose of persuasion, but at the same time, they're always troubled. But if we look at the context of the May 4th movement, then we know there's a very effective analogy. That is, we're studying with Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, 德先生的赛先生. So that's a clear and effective analogy. And not necessarily historical, but it took place in the historical context in modern China. So the one thing, and the second thing is, I really appreciate this question about the competing narratives of funding international order, or the rules for international order in the ancient world. So in the context of China, I think the recent debate is the Chinese scholars, for example, Yan Xuetong, right? He promotes the idea of moral realism. And he's reading into Chinese ancient politics and argued that the lessons the people could draw from the spring and the autumn period, if we can use that for the construction of a new international system, would be moral, would be ritual. It's a rule-based and a ritual-based society. And it echoes with what W.A.P. Martin writes about. And then if you look at the context of ancient Greek history, a lot of political scientists would argue that Thucydides, he invented realism. He invented this iron rule that about the balance of power. So there's an interesting conversation that is already taking place among international relations scholars. And I guess we can just follow that conversation. And the last question is also a question that keeps me awake at 3 a.m. in the morning, right? When we go to graduate school, the first book we were introduced is Peter Novick's book, That Noble Dream. So basically the book is talking about the 100 years of American scholars' effort to pursue objectivity. So it's our goal to try to approach objectivity, or try to grasp the truth.
However, we also understand as modern, maybe we can say postmodern historians, that this is a contingent process. So sometimes I'm making this analogy to my students, saying, we historians like the dog, and there's a flying frisbee, and we're always chasing it. But as a dog, we never get it. So that's my understanding, is our effort to pursue objectivity, to try to get a hold of the truth. But of course, we understand this is a contingent process. I'm writing about this Thucydides trap in 2022. And 10 years later, when people are writing about this topic, I'm sure the conclusion, the perspective, and approaches will change. And that's a good thing because our society evolves. So that's my little take on this issue. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. So we now just made a perfect landing at the scheduled beginning of the coffee break. So if we transmit the discussion or translate that back into the coffee room, then I think we could take our coffee break right now. And we come back at 3:45 for the second session this afternoon, which is going to be the keynote speech by Bill Kirby. Yeah, let's do that. Thank you very much for this beautiful panel. So, and yeah, I think that's